Sir Christopher Lee is remembered as one of the most imposing figures in the history of cinema. His height, his voice, and his ability to command a room made him unforgettable on screen. Whether he was portraying Dracula, Saruman, Count Dooku, or a number of villains and authority figures across a career that spanned more than 6 decades. Yet behind the roles and the carefully cultivated mystique was a real man shaped by war, discipline, education, and a complex relationship with truth and storytelling. Lee lived through the collapse of the old European order, served throughout the Second World War in active theatres, and later became a master of narrative in every sense of the word. This video looks at the full arc of Christopher Lee's life, from his aristocratic upbringing and wartime service to his rise in film and the later controversy surrounding how he framed his military record. It is not an attempt to diminish his achievements, but to understand how history, memory, and performance can blur together, even in the life of someone whose accomplishments never needed exaggeration. This is the story of Sir Christopher Lee, one of the many British war heroes. Now, before we get into the video, 99% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed. Now, if you enjoy this video or my content, then please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing. It really helps me out and it lets you stay up to date with my channel. Sir Christopher Frank Lee was born on the 27th of May 1922 in Belgravia, London, into an aristocratic lineage. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Trollope Lee, of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, had served in both the Boer War and the First World War, while his mother, Countess Estelle Marie Carandini di Sarzano, descended from Italian nobility and moved effortlessly among artists, diplomats, and high society figures. From childhood, Lee existed at the intersection of empire, privilege, and history. Yet this was not a stable upbringing. His parents separated when he was 4 and divorced 2 years later, and his mother relocated with Christopher and his sister Zandra to Switzerland. There, Lee absorbed languages, culture. Lee absorbed a European worldview that would later distinguish him from his contemporaries. It was also in Switzerland that he first appeared on stage, playing Rumpelstiltskin at a small academy. Returning to England, Lee entered a series of schools before entering Wellington College, where he excelled academically in classics, studying Latin and ancient Greek. He stood out in ways that were not always positive. He disliked organised sports, detested military drills, and admitted that during mock battles he would deliberately play dead to avoid attention. Discipline at Wellington was harsh, and Lee was frequently beaten. His adolescence coincided with the slow collapse of peace in Europe, and by the summer of 1939, financial disaster struck the family. His stepfather had accumulated enormous gambling debts. His mother separated once again, and Lee was forced to leave school early and find work. When war broke out in September 1939, Lee was hit with a harsh reality. Lee enrolled briefly in a military academy and volunteered to fight against the Soviet Union during the Winter War in Finland. Like many foreign volunteers, he was kept far from the front lines, issued winter equipment and assigned to guard duties. After only 2 weeks, the volunteers were sent home. Lee later admitted that although he could shoot, he could not ski, and that had he reached the front, he would likely have been killed. It was his first confrontation with the gap between romantic ideas of war and its unforgiving truth. Back in Britain, Lee worked for the United States Lines and later Beecham's Pharmaceuticals, joining the Home Guard as the Luftwaffe began bombing London. In March 1941, his father died of pneumonia. Realising he had no desire to follow his father into the army, but determined to serve meaningfully, he volunteered for the Royal Air Force. He trained at RAF Uxbridge and Paignton, before being sent overseas under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, sailing to southern Rhodesia. Flying training in Africa seemed to offer Lee a future in the air, but it ended abruptly. During training flights in Tiger Moths, he developed severe headaches and blurred vision. Medical examinations suggested optic nerve damage, and he was grounded permanently before completing his first solo flight. For Lee, this was devastating. The dream of becoming a pilot vanished overnight, and he was left drifting through postings with no clear role. The death of a fellow trainee from his old school deepened his despondency. Rather than accept stagnation, Lee sought purpose. Drawing on his intelligence, languages, and initiative, he applied to join the RAF intelligence. His superiors approved, and he was seconded into intelligence-related duties, including a brief posting as a warder in Salisbury Prison, before being promoted and transferred north through Egypt. By 1942, Lee was working in intelligence roles around the Suez Canal zone, before being commissioned as an officer in early 1943. He was then attached as an intelligence officer to 260 Squadron RAF, a ground attack unit flying Hurricanes and later Kitty Hawks during the North African campaign. His role was demanding and unglamorous. He was expected to know everything about enemy positions, brief pilots, coordinate with ground forces, and manage information under constant pressure. As the Allied advance pushed westwards across Egypt into Libya, the squadron leapfrogged between exposed desert airstrips, often flying multiple missions a day. Lee experienced repeated airfield bombings and near-death encounters, including narrowly escaping when an airfield came under attack. The campaign carried on through Tobruk, Benghazi, and eventually into Tunisia, where Axis forces dug in along the Mareth line. Lee was nearly killed again during an airfield bombing before the Axis surrender in May 1943. The squadron then prepared for the invasion of Sicily, moving through Libya, Malta, and into southern Italy. During this period, Lee suffered repeated bouts of malaria, at one point contracting it 6 times in under a year. After Sicily, the Italian campaign proved even harsher. Lee was seconded into the army during an officer exchange scheme and spent much of the Battle of Monte Cassino attached to Gurkha units of the 8th Indian Infantry Division. The fighting at Cassino was among the bloodiest of the war, marked by repeated failed assaults, massive artillery bombardments, and catastrophic casualties. Lee later described witnessing war at its most brutal, a far cry from any romantic notion of heroism. During this time, he narrowly avoided death once more when a crashed aircraft left live bombs scattered across an airstrip. In late 1944, Lee was promoted to flight lieutenant and posted to Air Force Headquarters, where he worked on planning and liaison duties for potential operations against a rumoured German Alpine stronghold. After the war in Europe ended, Lee was seconded to the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects. Fluent in multiple languages, he assisted in the administrative process of identifying, interrogating, and processing suspected Nazi personnel. Lee completed his RAF service in 1946 and retired to civilian life with what contemporaries would have called a good war. He had served continuously in active theatres, often under fire, performing intelligence and liaison roles that were essential but rarely celebrated. There was nothing inadequate about this record. Yet, over time, especially as Lee became famous, his wartime service began to take a sort of mythic quality. Lee was famously evasive when asked about his service. He later stated that he'd been attached to Special Forces units, which was true, but often declined to clarify that he'd served as an RAF liaison officer rather than a member of the SAS, SOE, or LRDG. He did not explicitly claim actions he did not perform. Historians such as Gavin Mortimer and Guy Walters later argued that Lee encouraged embellishment, at times suggesting secrecy where none legally existed. While many wartime SAS veterans openly published memoirs as early as the late 1940s, Lee implied he was forbidden from speaking, a claim historians dispute. This tendency toward embellishment did not erase his service, but it complicates it. After the war, Lee turned down the chance to return to office work and drifted into acting almost by chance. The early years were difficult, with casting agents dismissing him as too tall or unconventional. Slowly, through persistence and observation, he learned his craft. His breakthrough came with Hammer Films, where his portrayal of Frankenstein's monster and later Count Dracula redefined horror cinema. Over decades, Lee built a career spanning horror, historical epics, thrillers, and eventually global franchises. He played villains not as caricatures, but as fully realised figures. In later years, he became Saruman in The Lord of the Rings and Count Dooku in Star Wars, roles that introduced him to new generations and cemented his legacy. Beyond acting, Lee pursued music with the same intensity. Classically trained, he recorded heavy metal albums well into his 90s, becoming the oldest performer to chart on Billboard. Sadly, Christopher Lee died on the 7th of June 2015 at the age of 93. Tributes poured in from across the world, celebrating a man whose presence shaped cinema for more than half a century. Christopher Lee's life was extraordinary. He served in wartime intelligence roles that placed him close to danger, navigated the brutal realities of 20th century conflict, and emerged into a post-war world where he could reinvent himself as one of cinema's most enduring figures. The controversy surrounding his wartime stories does not erase his service, nor does it negate the value of what he actually did. Lee was many things: a soldier, an actor, a musician, a linguist, and above all, a performer. I will leave you on one of Christopher Lee's most famous quotes, which directly calls back to his service in World War II. When Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings, gave Christopher direction for the scream he wanted him to do when his character dies, Christopher Lee famously told director Peter Jackson, "Have you any idea what kind of noise happens when somebody's stabbed in the back. Because I do. If you enjoyed this video going through the life of Christopher Lee, then please leave it a like, subscribe and turn that bell notification on, share the video with your friends, and most importantly, leave me a comment. Let me know you enjoyed the video, and also let me know who or what I should talk about next. Because sometimes history doesn't need a rewrite, it just needs to be told properly.
Wars are always the same, basically. They're tribal, they're religious, but basically I think they're political.